This episode of the Quality Impact Podcast is proudly sponsored by Catalyst Consulting, specialists in Lean Six Sigma, operational excellence, and business transformation solutions. Catalyst Consulting helps organizations achieve lasting success.
When challenges come faster than ever, our ability to think differently becomes a superpower. Dr. Ken Hudson, inventor of switch thinking, joins us to discuss how teams and leaders can adapt their thinking at speed, drawing on brain science, creativity, and experience across global organizations. You're tuned into Quality Impact. I'm your host, Rashad Issa. Join me as I explore how leaders and teams can balance structure with creativity, control, and innovation. Dr. Ken Hudson joining us all the way from Australia. Good day to you.
G'day, Rashad.
It is early morning where I am here, so I'm really excited to get my brain to think differently and to start switching across as we progress. But why don't we start with a little bit about what is switch thinking, please?
Okay, so switch thinking is a concept that I've developed based on an insight watching bilingual people switch languages. I was at a conference in Singapore, and at lunchtime, a colleague sat down, and she was a Singaporean lady, and she spoke to me in English and then talked to a colleague in Mandarin. And I'm not bilingual, and I was just in awe of her ability to switch between different languages. And I thought, that's a learned skill. So perhaps if you could learn how to switch languages, maybe you could also learn how to switch your mode of thinking. And so switch thinking, if you like, is the ability to switch between different modes of thinking. And I call these two modes, and no doubt we'll get into a bit more detail, but box mode and ball mode. And they basically roughly approximate the latest brain research around switching between your central executive network and your default mode network. So it's any time that you switch your thinking.
I was listening to one Harvard researcher that says in her latest research that having the idea of a left side brain versus a right side brain is not entirely true, that the brain functions in one big neurological organ as such. And we need both sides of the brain to operate. So we need the analytical side to drive creativity, and we need the creative side to drive analysis and to solve problems. In quality management, driving improvements based on facts and analytics cannot operate without creatively engaging with stakeholders in the entire process. How can organizations balance that discipline with the freedom to switch perspectives?
If you think about a switch, that's why I really like the word switch, if you like. You know, you can switch a light switch, for example, it's on and off. You can switch your concentration levels. You can only have a conversation when you switch between talking and listening. So the idea is that creativity without analysis and without evaluation and without rigor often is just a wild idea that it has potential energy, but actually has no great value. But the reverse is also true. If it's all logical, rational, analytical without a splash of creativity, a splash of doing something new and different, then it becomes, you can get stuck. And it becomes customers, consumers, stakeholders can get bored, and your competitors can come in. So I think it's a switching between is the magic. It's the interaction between if you like, the two different modes of thinking. And that's also why I use the word modes, because rather than people. Historically, it was always you're a creative person or you're not a creative person. And that's just not very helpful. At work, you could be in not a particularly creative role, but you go home and play the flute. You write poetry. So when you talk about modes, it's a much more empowering, I think, idea that we can just switching between these different modes. So I think that's the key, is switching between what I call, as I said, I'll show my box mode. And box, just to dig down a little on that, it's a lovely metaphor for boxes, structured, comfortable, safe, it's logical. And if you compare that to what I call being in ball mode, And ball mode, by comparison, fun, playful, imaginative, creative, but not very comfortable or safe to sit on. But when you have the two together, if you like, and you can switch between them, that's the magic, I think.
I'm going to have to get myself a small box and a small ball and keep them at my desk to help me tune into that switching. I really like it, Ken. You were inspired by bilingual speaking, as you said, shifting languages. In your experience, what's the organizational equivalent of when leaders successfully switch between modes of thinking or operating?
A lot of the things that I'm suggesting, leaders, teams, individuals are doing it intuitively anyway. You know, for example, I was talking to my physiotherapist, for example, and he was treating me and he was asking me about my work. And he said, I didn't even know I was doing that, but I talk differently to the professional athlete versus the child that comes in with a sore toe or something, to myself, a middle-aged guy that's has got a sore back from playing golf or something. So it's when we allow ourselves to be more flexible, both in the way we communicate, and it's also helping our colleagues and our team, for example, look at something in a different way. And so when you look at something in a different way, there's this kind of burst of energy, the release of energy, and people go, aha, oh yes, now I get it. And they often in my workshops go, why didn't I see that before? So a very quick story just to illustrate, it's a non-business example, but my eldest daughter was having her 12-year-old, this is ages ago, a birthday party, and she wanted a horse riding party. And of course, I said fine and organised it all, and then they all headed off. And then she said to me, look, Dad, you're coming with me, aren't you? And of course, everyone looking at me, and I don't like horses. I was a bit nervous around them. And I felt embarrassed. I had to go. And then I looked at the horse and I went, actually, you know what? You're just a big dog. And I've grown up with dogs, love dogs, incredibly peaceful and calm around a dog. Now, the horse hadn't changed. The horse could be any challenge, problem, issue. But when you look at it differently, suddenly all these options and possibilities emerge. And I think that's also one of the great aspects of being able to switch a bit in your thinking. And I was thinking about the application for your organization and for quality generally. And I think more and more it's about the quality of your thinking and how you can use, for example, AI and view that not as a threat, but as a thinking partner, how you can work with your colleagues, and also more and more being able to think by yourself. You know, and that's all possible with these kind of simple, easy idea of switching.
The brain is really a powerful organ. So if we know how to utilize it.
No, exactly right. And the great beauty also is because switch thinking is informed by a lot of brain science, the brain is actually switching between these different networks automatically. And there's a thing called a network called the salience network, which actually says basically, what network is most appropriate for this situation? Do I need to be in central executive planning, structured network, or can I use the more imaginative, creative network? So we're mirroring what's happening in our brain anyway. It's pretty exciting.
Quality professionals are taught to identify root causes and eliminate variations in processes. How might switch thinking help teams avoid becoming too rigid or process-bound while still maintaining standards and assurance?
One of the principles of switch thinking is, I guess one of the ideas, if you like, is the 2-minute switch. And the 2-minute switch is this idea where you can actually say to people, look, yes, this is a way that we've done things in the past. This is the way this normally works. But for 2 minutes, let's try and think of a different approach. Let's play with something a bit different. And I got the idea because I wrote a book called Speed Thinking some years ago, and it was built around this kind of, if you like, 2-minute sprint. It's like a mental sprint. Because what I found is that what stops people from being as creative as they possibly can in the first place is themselves. their own filter. What if I'm wrong? What if I look silly? And so I found a great way to overcome that is just to actually get people to think really quickly. In 2 minutes, give me 9 ideas, ready, set, go. Boom. So they have no time to filter, they just create. And so with switch thinking, I've applied the same idea. And you say to people, okay, by individually or with the group to say, okay, this is the way we've normally done it. It's fine. For 2 minutes, let's try something new and see what happens. Now, the great beauty of the switch idea is that once you've tried it, you can actually switch back. So it's not permanent. It's a bit like trying on a new outfit and you go, oh, that jumper doesn't work. Okay, I'm going to take it off and go back to what I was wearing before. The other great benefit is if you say to people, we're only going to switch for 2 minutes, people are more willing to give something a go, to take a risk, because they know they can switch back. And so it's actually, a powerful idea to actually say to people, let's be consistent. Let's look for variations, issues, problems, but maybe there's a better way and we can explore it for 2 minutes. And of course, the other thing, if it doesn't work out, you've lost 2 minutes. Nothing.
Yes, it's creating that sort of comfort zone. So if they're uncomfortable about trying something different, you've just simplified it by saying, let's just try it for 2 minutes. And that eliminates the discomfort of I'm going to change my life, or I'm going to change my way of thinking, or I'm going to change the way I do this process. You've just limited it and gave them that safe space.
That's exactly right. And that's a fantastic insight. And then what happens, I found over time, is when people get better at this sort of 2 minute switch, they go, actually, last time that we got a new idea, actually, why don't we try it again? And before you know it, it becomes just the way we do things. It becomes more habitual. Or sometimes they just go, actually, we've got our existing way. And in 2 minutes, we came up with a new idea. What if we try and connect them and take a bit of that and a bit of that? And we'll mix an apple and an orange and a banana and add in some yogurt. Oh, we've got fruit salad.
Love it. You've worked with organizations like 3M and Adidas, companies known for innovation. What patterns have you observed in teams that are able to switch effectively between creativity and control?
I think a number of things. One is they realize what's made them successful. And it's often they get back to their brand, their values, the processes that made them successful. But they're also willing to say, well, actually, why don't we try something new? And it's not something completely new that they're not betting the business. They're just betting a few things that say, what if we introduce a new shoe, for example, or something with a bit of a variation that builds on what we're doing. And culturally, I think that's also it's probably the most important, the idea of having fun, taking a few risks, having leaders that talk about the importance of creativity and innovation. I once did some work with a big hotel chain in Australia, and the leader was saying, look, I want my team to be more innovative. And I said, but how many times do you actually use the word innovation, for example? And he reflected and said, actually, I never really talk about it. And I said, if you want someone to be more innovative, you've got to talk about it, recognize it, reward it, encourage it. So leadership plays a really important role, having fun, time to play, but also sticking close to what you're good at and has worked in the past, but not being bound by that. In Adidas' case, for example, one of their big opportunities was that with more and more people working from home, they realized there was this old thinking, if you like, which said we have clothes we wear to work and clothes we wear to play sport or to go out. But there was a gap in the middle. And so they increasingly realized that actually, why don't we just start designing clothes that you can wear to work, at home, and to go do a workout, go to the gym, go shopping. So often it's following and reacting to what's happening with customers as well.
You did mention about sticking to what you know, but not being bound by those past limitations. And that's an area I'd like to explore. It's one of the promises of switch thinking, which is to free your mind from past limitations. What are some of the most common mental blocks in experienced professionals, and how can they reframe or switch out of them?
Imagine if you were driving to work and then over time you work out what's the best way to drive to work. You get on the M5 highway and then you turn right and you turn left, etc. So you're now forming these patterns in your head, in your brain, and the patterns are incredibly efficient. And so it makes sense for you to follow these patterns. Now, one day there's a holdup, there's an accident, or there's some roadworks. Your usual way of going to work, there's a lot of traffic, and there's a side street. And you go, actually, I've never been down that side street. I wonder if I might just go explore this little side street and see where it takes me, because at the moment I'm just stuck in this traffic. And in a sense, switch thinking, those little side streets, those kind of mental shortcuts. So you have your prevailing patterns, which are built up over time, and then switch thinking allows you to go off your main patterns and bypass the traffic. The problem is that we get stuck in these patterns, and in a changing world, if we don't look for the shortcuts, the side streets, the patterns that we always use get more and more rigid. And so things like assumptions, for example, become, rather than just assumptions, they become rules. And one of the things I've often done with leadership groups is say, let's make all your assumptions and beliefs and conventions explicit. So let's get it out. Yeah. So, we have a session where we go, I always understood we had to sell this for under $50. And we put it up on the board, for example. And then someone goes, why is that? And then they work it out. It was 10 years ago. Someone said $50 and the whole world's changed. But over time, that becomes like a rule and you can't break free of it. And so one of the things I ask leaders to do in their teams is to actually just to say, make it explicit, and then you can challenge it. You can overturn it. Maybe we should have a $300 version of something. Maybe we should have a free version. Let's explore that for a couple of minutes. Assumptions, conventions, following the competition, following what we've always done. They're all the kind of road rules in our mind that we're following when we actually don't have to. It's just when someone steps back and goes, why are we doing that? And in fact, I have 6 switches to help people switch from box mode to ball mode. One of the switches is switching the questions that you ask. And that's a very powerful way to actually say, we're always asking the same questions. What if we asked a different question? What if we asked a question a customer might ask? What if we ask a naive question versus an expert question? The assumptions, beliefs, conventions are the kind of rules that we can get trapped by.
I really find this fascinating because in the quality profession, we work a lot with businesses when we're going on to identifying some gaps or some areas that need focus. We look into process mapping. And the whole idea is we always start with mapping the process as it is. And we bring it to a visual state so as then process owners can look at it and then realize that's the reality of what happens. And that tend to prompt them to think, why are we doing it this way? I didn't realize this has been going on. And if we apply the same way to those assumptions and conventions, I like that you said, if we bring them together and help them to make it explicit, that will help them realize that they've been working out of a habit that became a rule rather than the right way to work in this current context. I really like that.
Doing this switch thinking, if you like, intuitively, the idea of switching, for example, from words to pictures, from looking at the parts, and then switching and looking at the whole. One of the other switches, for example, is switch your focus. You can decide what you focus on. You can focus on the sale, for example, and you can focus on the customer relationship. You can focus on what exists at the moment, and then you can go switch what could exist. and you're constantly alternating and switching back and forth. It's a bit like a football example. It's defense and attack. It's a switch between. In the old days, we had, as I understand it, we had attackers who basically didn't do any defending. They just stood up the front line. And then we had defenders who didn't do any attacking. Now the modern game is attackers defend and defenders attack. And the midfield links both. And that's switch thinking is a bit like that now.
Ken, if you could embed one switch thinking principle into every organization's continuous improvement culture, what would it be?
One is the 2-minute switch. It's just so simple. It's incredibly efficient. It's very powerful. You can switch back. It's safe, but creative because you can actually let your imagination run wild. So the 2-minute switch would be one. And related to that is a concept which is where I talk about something like you switch off and you switch on, and you only do it for 2 minutes. So, for example, you say, let's switch off logic. Let's switch off analysis, for example, and let's switch on our intuition. We only have to do it for 2 minutes, but to make space for our creativity, we've got to, in a sense, switch something off. Back to the conversation, to actually have a decent conversation, we have to switch off talking to switch on listening. And so the idea, I think, is switch off planning, switch on testing. What I'm trying to do is to give people some tools. There's all these tools in the quality movement. Because if you say to people, look, your group or team, go and be creative in the corner, it's just not very helpful. It sounds good, but we're not taught to think like that. But when you give people a tool, 2 minutes, switch on, switch off, switch your perspective, switch your focus, switch the rules, switch your questions, people go, good, thank you.
2 minute switch on, switch off, and be specific of what we're asking them to switch to, or perspectives or questions. That is a very useful tool. Thank you very much, Ken. One last thing before I let you go back to your evening. I am very much fascinated by the rabbit example. So why don't you share with us a little bit more about rabbits?
I was trying to illustrate the idea that the switch doesn't have to be logical. How do we get more people to a movie theater, for example? And a rabbit popped into my head. I don't know why. It's just completely random. But that was the point. So I went to AI and said, okay, can you use rabbit, a random prompt, completely random, to help us increase the popularity of people going to the movie theaters? And then AI comes back and says, actually, okay, instead of sending people down a rabbit hole, we could make the theaters more comfortable, more cuddly. Maybe we should have big ear listening sessions, et cetera, et cetera. One of the great things we can use with AI, which I love, is AI never gets tired. We don't have to wait for a brainstorming group to be creative with AI. It's always available. It doesn't cross its arms and say, that's a silly question. And so often, don't be scared in the 2 minutes is for people to say, ask a random question, give people a random prompt, give people a random focus. We've always been focused on our competition, for example, Switch. Why don't we focus on a startup from an industry in fashion, for example? That's where often wonderful new original ideas can emerge.
That is really fascinating, because when I saw that example, it really triggered lots of ideas in my brain as well. And I was very much intrigued by the idea of a completely random prompt and then a random animal, a rabbit, to then move it into driving more footfall into movie theaters. And I thought, it's amazing how the brain worked. And it was just one word. And then the magic, as you called it, triggered all of those ideas and connected back to the thought. And that was really an easy, for me personally, demonstration of how randomness, switch, can really help drive focus and shift the mindset and perspective.
And because if we're always asking the same questions, we're always got the same focus, the same perspective, we always get the same answers. And so sometimes we have to use this random. Now, where did random come from? Who knows? But what I've learned is I trust my brain. My mind is going, actually, a rabbit might help you, Ken. But I go, fantastic. Okay, I'll go with the rabbit and see where it goes.
Fantastic. A huge thanks to Dr. Ken Hudson for joining us here on Quality Impact. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit subscribe and leave us a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks to our producer, Luke Nixon. I've been your host, Rashad Issa. See you next month.